Empires, inventions, corporations, all fell the same way. Not by accident, by design. The clause was standard by 2001. No software update reaches a Nokia handset without network operator certification. Not a technical safeguard, a contractual one, written into the carrier agreements before the device ever shipped, before the user ever bought it, before anyone at Nokia had reason to believe it would matter. This is the mechanism this file exists to document. Not a company that got slow. A company that signed away its own update speed in fighting years before speed became the metric that decided the smartphone war. In 2001, that decision looked like discipline. Symbian Limited was not Nokia acting alone. It was a consortium: Nokia, Ericsson, Sony Ericsson, Motorola, Symbian, each holding a stake, each contributing engineering, each bound by shared governance. The explicit goal was to prevent exactly what had happened to the personal computer industry a decade earlier. One company, one operating system, one company extracting margin from every device sold by every manufacturer. Symbian was built as the alternative. Distributed ownership. No single vendor could dictate terms to the rest. On paper, and in the boardroom logic of the era, this was the correct structure. It solved the monopoly problem that every phone executive had watched Microsoft and Intel solve for themselves, at everyone else's expense. What is rarely stated in the retrospectives is how deliberately this consortium structure was built to be slow. Slowness was not a side effect the founding partners tolerated. It was, in a real sense, the feature they were purchasing. A system that no single company could unilaterally redirect was, by construction, a system that no single company could unilaterally accelerate either. Governance by committee meant that every architectural decision of consequence had to clear the competing commercial interests of 5 hardware manufacturers who were, simultaneously, direct competitors in the handset market. Nokia wanted one roadmap. Sony Ericsson wanted another. Motorola had its own timeline tied to its own carrier relationships. Symbian, the smallest partner and the one whose engineering had originated the code base, had the least leverage to insist on anything. The consortium did not fail to anticipate speed as a competitive axis. It actively organized itself around a different axis entirely, the prevention of vendor lock-in. And that organizing principle was structurally incompatible with the rapid, centralized iteration a smartphone operating system would eventually require. This was the first mortgage taken out against the future, years before the carrier contracts compounded the debt. Layered onto this consortium was the business model that defined mobile telephony at the time. Carriers subsidized the handset. A network operator would take a phone that cost real money to manufacture and hand it to a customer for a fraction of that price, recouping the difference over a 2-year contract. This was not a minor financial detail. It was the entire distribution engine of the industry. And because the carrier was fronting the capital, the carrier set the terms. Branding on the device, custom menus, preloaded services, control over what software touched the phone and when. Manufacturers agreed to this because there was no other route to the customer that moved comparable volume. Given the incentives on the table in 2001, this was not naivety. It was the only version of the business that made sense to the people running it. Consider what the carrier was actually purchasing with that subsidy, because it clarifies why the certification clause was non-negotiable from the operator's side of the table. The carrier was not simply buying volume, it was buying the exclusive right to mediate the customer relationship for the life of the contract. Every menu the customer touched, every preloaded service that generated referral revenue, every software update that might quietly remove a carrier's branded application or alter a billing integration the carrier depended on for ongoing revenue. A software update was never, in the carrier's accounting, a neutral technical event. It was a potential threat to a monetization layer the carrier had built directly into the handset software stack. Certification queues were not bureaucratic friction for its own sake. They were a revenue protection mechanism, functioning exactly as designed, for exactly the party that designed them. Nokia was not dealing with a slow partner. Nokia was dealing with a rational one, defending its own margin through the only lever the contract gave it. Here is the specific defect, isolated. Nokia's carrier contracts did not merely permit operators to brand a handset. They required certification and sign-off before any software update could be pushed to a device sold through that carrier's channel. Every carrier, every regional variant, every custom build. A single Symbian handset might exist in a dozen different software configurations depending on which operator sold it. Each one needing separate testing, separate approval, separate release scheduling, controlled not by Nokia's engineering calendar, but by the carrier's certification queue. The documented result was update cycles running 6 to 12 months per handset variant, sometimes longer, for changes that were often already finished on Nokia's side and sitting in the queue, waiting for sign-off that had nothing to do with code quality. This was not a technical bottleneck. Nokia's engineers were not the constraint. The constraint was a clause. There was no channel by which Nokia could reach its own users directly. Every update had to pass through a party whose commercial interest in that update was, at best, neutral. It is worth being precise about what neutral meant in practice, because neutral is generous. A carrier's certification department had no revenue incentive tied to shipping a Nokia software fix faster. Its budget, its headcount, its internal priorities were set by the carrier's own commercial calendar. New device launches, marketing campaigns, holiday sales windows, none of which aligned with Nokia's engineering timeline. A critical security patch and a cosmetic menu change entered the same queue and were often processed with the same institutional indifference, because from the certification department's perspective, both were simply line items competing for finite testing hours against network rollout projects that carried far greater internal priority. Nokia had, in effect, outsourced the pacing of its own product to departments inside other companies that had no organizational reason to care about that pacing at all. From 2001 to roughly 2006, this defect generated no visible symptoms. Symbian held between 60 and 70% of global smartphone market share through most of this window. Carriers were satisfied. They retained control, and control was the point of the arrangement for them. Nokia's hardware margins were strong enough to absorb the friction of slow software iteration. A device sold well on build quality, battery life, and brand trust well before update velocity became something a consumer noticed or asked about. There was no competing distribution model in the market to expose the ceiling this structure had already built in. But underneath that dominance, the fracture was already spreading. Symbian itself was splitting into incompatible interfaces. S60 for Nokia, UIQ for Sony Ericsson and Motorola, MOAP for Japanese carriers, each requiring separate engineering, each subject to its own certification pipeline, each making the update problem marginally worse with every fork. Market leadership did not resolve this, it simply made it invisible. There is a specific irony embedded in those 5 years of dominance that deserves isolation on its own. Every unit sold under this model reinforced the carrier's confidence that the arrangement was working, which meant every renewal of every carrier contract during that window re-signed the same certification clause, often with tighter terms rather than looser ones, because Nokia's negotiating position depended on carrier goodwill far more than the reverse. Success did not create the opportunity to renegotiate the defect out of the system. Success removed the pressure that might have forced the renegotiation to happen at all. The company was, in the most literal sense, strengthening the exact mechanism that would later prove terminal, at the precise moment it had the most leverage in its entire history to change it. Subscribe to see the next collapse that was designed in, not just discovered. Then the concealment ended on a specific date through a specific deal. In January of 2007, Apple launched the iPhone through an exclusive agreement with AT&T. But the defining term of that agreement was not exclusivity. It was that Apple, not AT&T, retained control of the software stack. Updates shipped from Apple directly to the device. No carrier certification queue, no per-operator build. One software timeline, controlled by the manufacturer for every unit sold. A year later, Google's Android extended a version of the same principle across multiple hardware makers, keeping the update path substantially outside the carrier customization loops that had defined the previous decade. Neither of these was, in this file's terms, simply a better product. Each was a different distribution architecture, one that removed the exact gatekeeper Nokia's contracts had installed by design. What had been dormant for 5 years became terminal within 2. Symbian's contracts had not created a slower phone. They had created a system incapable of shortening its own update cycle even after the cost of that slowness became fatal, because the authority to shorten it did not belong to Nokia. It belonged to hundreds of separate carrier certification departments, each operating on its own schedule, none of them incentivized to move faster on Nokia's behalf. It is tempting to describe Nokia's response after 2007 as denial, but the internal record suggests something colder. Recognition without authority to act. Engineers inside Nokia understood the update problem well before the market punished them for it. Internal proposals to consolidate variants and streamline certification circulated for years without resolution, because dismantling the carrier certification structure meant renegotiating dozens of active contracts with partners who had no commercial reason to grant Nokia the very control it was asking for. The fix was diagnosed correctly and blocked precisely by the mechanism the diagnosis identified. Nokia could see the wall. It had signed away the only tool that could have moved it. This is not a pattern unique to one Finnish manufacturer. BlackBerry's collapse traces through a structurally comparable dependency, not on carriers directly, but on enterprise IT departments and the BlackBerry Enterprise Server contracts that gave corporate administrators, not end users, control over what could change on a device and when. In both cases, the entity that controlled the pace of iteration was not the entity trying to compete on iteration speed. The category is a distribution gatekeeper whose incentives diverge from the product's need to move quickly, granted contractual leverage over the update path in exchange for market access at the time that access mattered most. The names change, the mechanism does not. The same architecture, a manufacturer trading update authority to a distribution partner in exchange for shelf space, is still the default model in categories well beyond phones. Smart televisions, automotive infotainment systems, and enterprise hardware sold through third-party resellers all carry versions of this same clause today, largely unexamined, largely unremarked upon, sitting in contracts signed for reasons that make complete sense to the people signing them right now. The file closes not because the mechanism ended in 2007, but because it simply relocated, waiting in categories where no one has yet been forced to read the certification clause aloud in public.